Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be doing an updated unique unit tier list. So this is going to be for 2021. I did one about a year ago as well, and that one was based on the meta there, and that one also didn't include the secondary unique units like the Portuguese Caravel we can see on the screen, the Camel Archer here, Flaming Camels in there, as well as a bunch of other things like the Janitor. So this new list will include those units. I didn't include them in the past. And also there's been a lot of meta changes based on playstyles, but also based on balance changes to these unique units, that it's about time for another list. And also, my experience as a player, my opinion on certain units has changed over time as I gained more experience. So I feel like it's about time we make a new list and see where all these different unique units stand compared to each other. This time I had some space on screen, so right above me, I've actually placed the criteria of how I'm going to rank these unique units against each other. So the first one is going to be how viable it is. So for example, it's not viable to go fast cast war elephants because war elephants are very slow and it's hard to have good mobility, which is what you need in early castle. Whereas fast castle conquistadors, well, that's a lot more viable because you have a lot more mobility. It's a range unit to get the snipe over walls. It's a lot easier to use. So that's going to be the main criteria of how viable it is to invest into the castle and actually make this unique unit, because as you guys know, unique units by definition are going to be less efficient to tech into than any other unit like archer, range units, stable units, because you need a castle to make them. So that's their inherent weakness. So that's the first criteria, the most important one. Second one, not as important, but right below it is going to be the role it plays for the civ. So for example, Goths without the Husker are very bad. That's just one example I'm going to give. They depend on their unique unit, and therefore the Husker has high value for them. And that's going to be one of my criteria as well, and a pretty high one as well, because at the end of the day, unique units are there to complement a certain civ for a certain strategy, and I want to see how important that unique unit is for civs, and that definitely matters on the list. The third one is going to be power relative to cost. So for example, a war elephant is very powerful, but it's also very expensive. So I'm going to keep in mind how costly it is versus how strong it is as a unit. And then the fourth thing, which is the least important, but still I'm going to consider in some cases, is the pop efficiency. So for example, in late game and team games where you have 40 pop as trade, 100 as villagers, you have only 40 to 60 left on average for military. You need to have some strong units there because you don't have a lot of population. So an easy way to think about this is, if I have 40 war elephants versus 40 boyars, well, which one is going to be more pop efficient? If they're fighting against each other, the war elephant is obviously more pop efficient because it's going to win that battle 10 out of 10 times. But again, the reason why this is going to be lower on my list is because pop efficiency only has a certain factor, of only plays a role in a small percentage of games. Remember, every game has a Dark Age. Almost every game has a Feudal Age. Most games have Feudal Age and Castle Age. And maybe a smaller percentage have Imperial Age, and then maybe even a very small percentage has post-Imp. So when you think about it that way, you'll see that my criteria goes in terms of stages of the game. The early stages have the higher value because we just see it more often and it's more important. All right, enough rambling. Let's hop into the list here. So I'm going to pull over my notepad and let's talk about some unique units. Sorry if the intro is too long. Let's hop into it. So the first one on my list, or on this little whatever you call it, pictures here, unique unit pictures, is going to be the Custelier. Now the Custelier is an interesting one. It actually one that came out and it was very, very overpowered, but that was due to multiple factors. It had higher damage that got nerfed, and it also had a glitch that it double damaged to archer units. So it was really overpowered when it first came out, but after the glitch got fixed, the numbers got tuned, it actually finds itself in a B tier. It's a good unit, but it's not something that's overpowered. It's not something that's insane. And the inherent weaknesses for it is that it's a melee unit, so it's definitely a weakness. And also, for unique units, generally speaking, you being melee is generally a weakness. And I can explain about that a little bit more later on. But the charge mechanic can be a plus side, can be a strength, but can also be a weakness. So Custelier in general has some weakness in that it can't do extended trades. And then the final thing is that it doesn't scale that well. The Elite Custelier gets more stats, but it only has 155 HP total and doesn't have the armor to really back it up like a Paladin does in terms of Pierce armor. So it has the strengths, but it also has its weaknesses. Overall, B tier makes sense. Oh boy, right away with kind of a trolly one, we have the Flemish militia, and I actually thought long and hard about it, and I ended up putting it at a B tier. I wasn't sure exactly where to put it because you can make a lot of arguments because the unit itself is very strong. The unit itself is kind of like a halberdier and a champion mixed in one unit. And the thing is, if this is a unit that you create from a castle, like a normal unique unit, I would probably put it at C tier because it's an infantry unit. It's not particularly strong against anything. It's more like a well-rounded unit. But the reason I put it at B tier is the role it plays for the Civ. You get like 100 of these at the same time with the unique tech. So with that in mind, 100 of these guys at the same time can be extremely hard to deal with. And I bumped it up a tier just because of that power spike that you can get. I still think that tech is kind of bad for the game, and it's a little bit sketchy in general to have that technology available. And I don't even think it's the most powerful technology, but the unit itself, when that tech is researched, is quite strong. So B tier for me makes sense. And then going to the Sergeant. Now the Sergeant is interesting. I actually initially thought of C tier, but I actually think this one is also going to land in the B tier. The late game Sergeants, or the Imperial Age Sergeants, I'm not talking about post-sim, but just even Imperial Age, is very powerful. And not only that, it's going to get buffed, or it has been already buffed recently, and I'm going off those stats. And it's buffed to a point where I have 85 HP, 11 attack base, 4 armor of each, melee and range. That is a very, very strong unit. And hard to deal with because it is an infantry and doesn't have an inherent weakness like the cavalry does with halberdier as a counter. So it's hard to find a counter. Remember, gunpowder isn't the best counter because Sicilians get 50% resilience to bonus damage. So even hand cannoneers isn't going to deal with a Sergeant that well. And so I think overall this unit, it's going to see a lot more play in the Sicilian strategy, especially in Imperial Age, and the Sicilians might see a little bit more play in competitive games because now it has a strategy. It's a one-trick Civ, and I don't like this. It's a one-trick Civ with the unique tech, and now that one trick has just been buffed. So we didn't make them a well-rounded Civ with this new buff. We just made them better at what they were already good at. So I think this might actually push them over the edge of not overpowered, but strong enough to see some play in tournaments and as a kind of a surprise pocket pick potentially. But I think the Sergeant is in a really strong spot at the moment. Definitely B tier for me. Not A because it's still an infantry unit and it's still slow to get into. Next up, I'm going to try to go a bit quicker here. We've got the Rambai. Now the Rambai I have it as B tier as well, which is, I know I'm kind of trolling you guys at this point. I've got a lot of B tier units, but Rambai got nerfed a lot recently. Actually, it has a little bit more splash damage now, it has a little bit more splash damage now, but less single target damage. In my experience, the Rambai is just not that good. It's good when you have a big mass of it, but it's just hard to get there. It's not good in the small bunches anymore. Like if you have 4 Rambai, you're not really gonna be one-shotting stuff like you used to, or like 4 maybe to 8 Rambai. You're not one-shotting stuff like you used to. You don't kill buildings like you used to. It's still a strong unit in general, but it definitely got a big hit. So B tier makes sense to me. And finally, something different. We got the Ballista Elephant, which will go to C tier. Ballista Elephant is insane when you mass it. The problem is it's just so hard to get to that mass that right away it's not going to be a viable unit in most cases. And even when you do get that mass, it has some weaknesses. Like halberdiers trickled in through open areas with rams can destroy the Ballista Elephant completely. Monks with extra range can destroy the Ballista Elephant completely. Think of a few other counters to it, like even range units in general that can outrange it can also do pretty well against Ballista Elephant. So Ballista Elephant's kind of in a weird spot where it's strong in late game, but it also has some weaknesses, and it's just not that good in early game. So makes sense at a C tier. It's not the worst unit in the game, but it's definitely not that viable and not easy to get into. Next up, we've got the Berserker, and this one I think we're gonna revisit the B tier. That is correct. We're gonna revisit the B tier here with the Berserker. And the reason I'm going to go to the B tier here is that Vikings have a massive economy, and they usually end up going with a fast Imperial Age or faster Imperial Age, Arbalest Ram or Arbalest opening in general, and then they have a lot of economy behind it. So a natural transition is either Pikemen with Chieftains or Berserkers with Chieftains, and that is a pretty solid unit. It becomes kind of like the Flemish militia in the sense that it's good against cav and it's good against other melee units. It's weak against archers, but if you think about it, Vikings should have the upper hand versus archer civs in general because you have faster arbalest most likely to Imperial Age, you have fully upgraded skirms, no problem, you have siege ram, so Berserkers kind of fits that that hole because they're missing halberdier. So Berserker kind of fits that hole against cav civs, and it absolutely destroys other infantries as well. So fixes your matchups like Goth, for example, is an easy win because you have the Berserker. So for me, the role it plays in the civ is pretty nice, and it's overall a solid unit. Definitely a B tier for me here. Next up, we've got the Boyar, and the Boyar is an interesting one. I'm going to put it lower than most people would think, I think. I'm going to put it at C tier. Now, the reason is, and it has been buffed recently, the Boyar, the concept of a Boyar itself, I have a problem with it because it's supposed to be a cavalry unit that's good against melee units with its high melee armor. The problem is cavalry are normally going to be fighting halberdiers. And if you're not fighting halberdiers, you're fighting some sort of archer unit. It's very rare that you're going to be fighting cav on cav, for example. That might occur in a team game setting. But in that setting where it's cav versus cav, the other player will be producing from stable. So even in that situation, he might even be able to overrun you before you can get your castle production and get Boyars going. So it ends up being very awkward as to where you can use it. However, it's not the worst unit ever. And it actually, you can make an argument for B tier because it has 3 pierce armor, which is the same as a paladin, albeit it's only 150 HP compared to the 180 of a paladin. And I think the attack is the same. So it's not a bad unit stat-wise, but I think the fact that you need castles for it, the fact that it has less HP than a paladin makes it worse. And the plus side of the Boyar, the specialty for it, is the extra melee armor. And I personally would say that doesn't have as much impact as you would think because halberdiers are still shredding those guys. Next up here, we've got the Camel Archer. And the Camel Archer is going to fit nicely in the A tier. So the first A tier unit here. And it's quite simple, really. Cav Archer type units are generally the best unique units because you can get them out early and you can make them survive. Using their mobility, they should never really be able to die. If you want to avoid fights, you can. If you want to hit and run, you can. And if you want to snipe over walls, you definitely can. So Cav Archer is like the best kind of unique unit because you get to mass it early and then maintain that mass throughout the game. And the Camel Archer is just good in early game, early castle. You could go for it. It's viable. And it also is really good in Imperial Age as well. So it's one of those units that scales really well. It's viable early. It's good late. The only reason I didn't put it as S tier is that it just lacks that factor where it's like an overpowered unit. Like it feels unfair to play against it. Like it still has some weaknesses versus fast Arbalest. It still can get countered by skirmishers, by siege. It's not like the perfect unit and has some weaknesses. So A tier makes the most sense for me. Next up, we've got the Caravel, which is actually going to follow straight into the A tier. And if you think about the Caravel and why it's A tier, right now in Islands, we have a meta that's going to be mostly Galleon Fest in Imperial Age. And Caravel will absolutely destroy galleons and destroy even the longboat from Vikings. And so I think for me, the unit does enough in the current meta on Islands to easily merit an A tier. Because it's just like the same thing as a galleon, but way stronger against galleons, just weaker against fast fire ships. But fast fire ships, they're not really in the meta right now in terms of 1v1 islands and even in team game islands as your main unit. You usually only use fast fire ships to counter caravels or to get like a fast imp spike potentially. So for that reason, it's just such a good unit for the Portuguese to have to make sure that they win all kinds of water engagements. And it can be so oppressive to deal with caravels if you're, for example, a Viking player. So definitely an A tier for me. Next up, we've got the Cataphract. Cataphract is going to find itself nicely in the B tier. Cataphract kind of reminds me of the Berserker in a way that it just solves exactly what the Civ, Byzantines, needs it to solve. Now, Byzantine, if you think about them, they have a counter to cavalry and the heavy camels and halberdiers that are both cheaper. Cheaper skirms and bomber cannons can easily counter archer civs. And they're kind of missing something against infantry. And that's where the Cataphract comes in. Counters infantry completely, and it could be viable in Castle Age and Imperial Age. And in Imperial Age, with all the upgrades, both unique techs, just the one unique tech. Sorry, the one unique tech, the elite upgrade, makes it actually a very strong unit. Just as far as cost efficiency goes, it could be kind of as strong as like a paladin in terms of fighting against melee units. Now, the thing about Cataphract and why it's not the strongest is that it's simply weaker against range units, and so it's not going to find itself in A tier, but for the role it accomplishes for the Civ, it's easily a B tier unit for me. Next up, we've got the Chikano, and this one is interesting. I'm going to put it in A tier, but honestly, I think this unit is like not that good. Let me explain myself. First of all, even with the elite upgrade, it actually has only 4 range. So against like skirmishers and stuff, it's possible to trade pretty well, or even Arbalest. It's possible to trade pretty well against Chikano just by using that easy range advantage, or that one range advantage, to just pick fights and fight from a bit further away. And even like Chikano, it has the specialty of it is that it has high damage output, but it has some weaknesses. Like it's not very mobile, and it also has like the less range, and it also needed to make it for castle, need a lot of upgrades for it. So I can see arguments for it being B tier just because I feel like it doesn't accomplish as much for Chinese as some unique units accomplish for their own respective civs. The reason though I decided to give it A tier is because I feel like it's the better overall late game option for Chinese, and that it doesn't die to ram. So it is going to be better than Arbalest. It does have more damage in most situations, but the Chikano is something that in my opinion has some weaknesses, and it does have more HP than Arbalest, so it could survive on-archer shots. So it has some pros over the Arbalest, but also has some cons versus them. But I think overall the pros outweigh the cons, and I'd rather see it at A tier than B tier. But I think it fluctuates between those two. Okay, let's pick up the pace here. The Condottiero is going to be a quick B tier. Not going to talk about it too much. The reason why it's B tier and why it's useful, even though the stats are weaker than a champion, you don't need any upgrades for it. It's also a team bonus, so it could stack with, say, the Malian Pierce Armor. So it has some really nice viability. Like, it has some really nice uses for it. And I think it comes up enough to say it's a pretty mid-tier option. I think it's not your go-to, but it has its place in Civ and also in team games. Next up, we're going to see our first S tier unit, the Conquestador, a classic Cav Archer class unit. It's just such a strong unit because it doesn't take upgrades. The viability of this is off the charts. You make a castle, 3 Conquistadors are already one-shotting villagers. You're making short work of knights with them. You can outrun archers, so you don't have to worry about those guys. You have high HP, high armor. I mean, it's just a perfect, well-rounded unit. I mean, you are taking bonus damage from skirmishers, but even then, you can just use your mobility to outmaneuver them. The only reason, the only problem with this unit is that Spanish don't have a good eco bonus behind it to really turbo into it and just be oppressive with it. So it kind of carries a civ that, struggles otherwise. But this is, as far as all my criteria goes, it's very viable, very important for the civ, pretty good pop efficiency for late game. And as far as cost versus power, I think it's pretty good too. It's expensive, but it's also very powerful. So for me, Conquistador is the gold standard as far as a raiding unit goes and as far as a unique unit goes from the castle. Perfect example of an S tier unit. We can move on to the Elephant Archer, which is going to be the exact same as the Conquistador, but for everything the Conquistador has, the Elephant Archer doesn't have. So it's in fact the exact opposite of the Conquistador. I just wanted to get you guys on a little run there. Yeah, it's the complete opposite of it. I'm still going to put it at C tier. Just because it's really good in late game, and it has been buffed recently to make it it actually does put out damage, It actually does put out some good damage. It's tanky. It has some weird uses, and in late game, it can be very obnoxious to push, especially in team games with a trade. It can be very obnoxious to push into it or to defend pushes from it, some heavy gold composition. So it has some uses, and similar to the Ballista Elephant, it's very tanky and very strong in late game, yet very expensive. But like I said, it's complete opposite of a Conquistador. It's not viable to get out early castlage. It's not good in the mid game. It's hard to tech into, and it requires a lot of upgrades to make work. So we can move on here to the Flaming Camel, which is just gonna land to a D tier. I mean, Flaming Camel just doesn't do anything. It's good against cavalry, but at the same time, cavalry, it's hard to catch cavalry off guard because they can easily just run away from you or not present themselves to you to use the Flaming Camel. So it's just more of a gimmick. It's very hard to use it. I think if Flaming Camel did more damage to buildings, it could be a bit more versatile, but then we run the risk of it just being like a petard on a horse thing, and I don't think we need that. So swiftly moving along here, we've got the Gabetto, and I actually went back and forth on the Gabetto, but I am actually going to land it in... Ooh, I'm actually leaning A tier. I wrote B tier on my list, but I'm actually thinking A tier. No, I'm going to say B tier. The reason I'm going to say B tier is that it kind of dies to a lot of archer units and even dies to skirms and castle because it's so squishy. But Gabetto itself is a pretty interesting concept and a pretty powerful unit. So Gabetto is like a throwing axeman, but it moves faster, so it does melee damage, but from a range. and it has enough speed to make it like a good hit and run unit, and it does very well against cavalry and infantry. But I think it just struggles too much against range units to justify putting it higher than B tier. And if you see your opponent going for Gibetto, you can just prepare any crossbow or skirmisher, or even just like a few scorpions can be hard to deal with as well sometimes. So it has just too many weaknesses. And as far as the late game unit, it's not bad, but it kind of, some other weaknesses come up like onagers, destroys. Unless you have good micro, of course, then it's like, you know, you can get away with it, but it's a bit risky. And even like Cav can run all over the Elite Gibetto. Like Paladin can run all over them in late game, for example. And it's not going to hold its own. So for me, B tier, it's pretty good. It accomplishes what you want from a hit and run unique units, and it's kind of weird to deal with in some cases, but it has enough answers that I don't think it's that special. Next up, we have the Janitor, and Janitor might seem like an underrated unit, and I thought so at first, but upon further thinking about it, it just doesn't fit properly in how games usually go. So how do I want to explain this? Basically, skirmishers, you can start massing in Feudal Age, and then you upgrade in Castle Age to deal with crossbowmen, which is the main archer threat in Castle Age. Whereas Janitor, you have to start massing in Castle Age. So if someone goes crossbow, they're at your base, you know, minute 21, because they went like minute arm to archer into crossbow. They have like 20 cross outside your base. You can't be like, okay, I'm going to start massing Janitor now. You're going to have like 4 Janitor. The guy's 20 crossbow, 25 crossbow. He's going to make short work of those, even if you're a counter unit, because he has more mass. And then you're stuck on the defense. So Janitor, more expensive than a skirm. Can't mass it in Feudal Age. It doesn't fit the role of what a skirm does. Now, it's not a D tier unit because the Janitor still is more pop efficient, and it's still a better unit in late game. And it's not that much more expensive. It still only costs food and wood, so it's kind of easy to tech into. So for that reason, I'm going to leave it at C tier. It has its uses, but it's not as good as people think it is, or it sounds like on paper. And that's why we don't see it that much in practice. Next up, we're going to have the Genoese Crossbowman, and that's going to be a B tier unique unit. Has only 4 range, even with elite upgrade, suffers the same problem as the Chikano. It has received a lot of buffs recently that pushed it from C tier to B tier, like it produces faster, costs less, and overall it's just a decent unit. It covers the Cav matchups that Italians could potentially struggle with because they don't have Halberdier. Genoese Crossbowman can easily be that unit that kind of destroys all cavalry units. And it gives them some nice matchups, like for example, Italian versus Persians. Genoese Crossbowman is going to be your go-to to win that matchup. So definitely has a role for the Civ. Next up is the Husker, and Husker, it's not that, no, I'm kidding. It's an S tier unit. It's an S tier unit. It's so good. As much as I always say that being an infantry unit makes you puts you at an inherent disadvantage because you're slow and you don't have range, Husker makes up for that really well. First of all, it's very cheap because of Goths. Oh, sorry about that. It's very cheap because of the Goths bonuses, and it also has a high Pierce armor, which covers the biggest weakness of infantry, which is archers, and it has very good stats: 10 attack, 60 HP. But I think the thing that pushes it over, over the edge from A tier to S tier unit is the role it plays for Goths. The role it plays for Goths is unmatched. It makes archer civ matchups completely dominant for Goths, and it forces the archer civs to play infantry. But when archer civs play infantry, that's playing into the Goths' strength, which is infantry themselves, so they can easily tech champions. So then it's champions versus champions, and then Huskers are in the mix as well to deal with any archers that the archer civ can throw at them. So Goths might not be the best civ overall, but as far as infantry, they do it perfectly, and Husker fits into that civ beautifully, and it itself is just a standalone amazing unit as well. Great for raiding, great for taking fights, and very cheap, cost-effective unit. Good for early game, early castle, very viable, and also good for late game. The only thing it struggles with is maybe pop efficiency, but I mean, all infantry will struggle with that, and Goths have an extra ton population anyways. It's an easy S tier for me, no problem. Give me 1 second, I'm going to wipe my nose with a mask. I don't think anyone has ever done that before. Don't worry, I'm not going to use that mask afterwards. It's already tainted with the Rona, and now with some boogers apparently. Anyway, swiftly moving along here. I don't know why I put that in the video. We have the Imperial Camel, and that's going to find itself nicely in the A tier. I mean, Imperial Camel is just an amazing unit. It's basically like the Paladin of the Camel line, and it makes it that you can't really mess around with Indians in the same way that you can mess around with heavy camels. Like for example, if you have like archer units against camels, against heavy camel, you'll be fine. Against Imperial Camel, all of a sudden, it's actually kind of difficult. The Imperial Camel is 2 extra attack, more HP, a lot more tanky, a lot stronger. and it just makes short work of Paladin and Cavalier, so it's a great unit. And then similarly, Imperial Skirmisher, it just does everything a Skirmisher does, but way better, so why not have it at A tier? The reason I don't have these units at S tier is because other civs have alternatives to deal with them. And for example, like the Imperial Skirmisher, maybe you can make an argument for S tier because it's a unique unit, but it can be placed for, it's a team bonus, it can be placed for its allies as well. So for example, Aztecs with Imperial Skirmishers can be pretty strong. Mayans shooting 2 javelins in Imperial Skirmishers can be really strong. So maybe this unit could merit an S tier, but honestly, it's still a skirmisher at the end of the day. You know what I mean? It's not going to be pop efficient. It's not going to be viable in the early game. It's still a skirmisher. So for that reason, A tier. It's the best of its kind, but it's not going to be like game breaking in most cases. All right, next up is going to be the Jaguar Warrior, and I'm sorry to disappoint any OG Montezuma fans. I like that campaign as well, but like Jaguar Warrior is just such a weird unit. And it's inherently way too situational and way too bad. Like, the thing is about the Jaguar Warrior is that it's an infantry, so it has all the weaknesses of infantry, and it counters other infantry which are already not that popular to begin with because of, as stated, the weaknesses that infantry face in this game, generally speaking. Its stats are also not that impressive. It's very comparable to a champion. It only has the attack bonus versus infantry. You need a castle to make it. And overall, I think the Aztecs don't rely on it, and the Jaguar Warrior is mainly something that counters Elite Eagle Warrior. That's basically the only use we ever see from it in Pro Age of Empires. So it's not enough for me. It's going to be a D tier, probably one of the worst unique units on the list. As you know, although it is a cool unit, it's just not viable in most cases. I've lost to it in the past, don't get me wrong, but again, only to counter Elite Eagle Warriors pretty much. Next up, we've got the Janissary. And Janissary is an interesting one. You could make an argument for S tier. I'm going to drop it down to A tier, however. It's a very strong unit. It has 8 range, which outranges most things in Castle Age. It has very high attack. Its accuracy has been buffed, not for itself, but for gunpowder in general, so it's stronger than ever right now in DE. But I just feel like it has some weaknesses because it's not on a horse, so it's not a cavalry unit. So, you know, archers and skirmishers can easily catch up with it and can keep it at bay, especially when you get ballistics. The one really powerful thing with the Janissary is that Janissary Magno combo and Castle Age can be very tough to deal with. But honestly, I compare it with the Conquistador, and I feel like the Conquistador wins out more often than not because of its mobility. And yeah, the Conquistador has 2 less range, but it also has more HP to make up for it and more armor as well. So I don't know. Janissary feels like a very strong unit. You can make an argument for S tier, but I just feel like it's easier to deal with than some of the S tier units. So I'm going to put it at A tier for now. Still a strong unit. Next up, we've got the Incas. And I'm not going to talk too much about it, but it's just going to be the Mamluke, where I'm going to put at the C tier. It's an infantry unit. It comes with a lot of the problems that infantry does. However, it does do well against cavalry and against other infantry units. It kind of dies to foot archers more often than not, though. And the reason why I put this at C tier and not a D tier compared to the Jaguar is that what it's good at, it does really well. Like, it wins a lot of fights. It stacks really nicely. It's really good in melee combat, and it makes short work of cavalry as well. So it's a pretty solid unit. It's just not going to see play more often than not. And I honestly don't think the Incas rely on the Mamluke too much. Like, even as a cavalry counter, they have halberdier. You know, as an archer counter, it's not. As an infantry counter, they have slingers. So Incas don't rely on the Mamluke too much. So it's a C tier unit, nothing more, nothing less. Next up, the Karambits, and that's going to find itself nicely at the C tier as well. Oh, sorry. I mean, it's pretty good, but it's kind of only a good option in late game, and it has a lot of weaknesses, and sometimes it's just not the right play. So it's kind of I don't have a lot of things to say about it. It could be really good sometimes, but a lot of times you don't even use it. And melee, like Karambit doesn't really solve anything for the melee that they can't solve otherwise, except maybe a raiding unit, because they're missing like strong light calf. So I don't know. Feels like an easy C tier option for me. Next up, we've got the Kipchucks, and the Kipchuck I'm actually going to put at B tier because it's a very strong unit. I actually think the Kipchuck is not overpowered, but kind of being slept on a little bit in some cases. I think a lot of pros are starting to recognize how strong it really is, though, especially with the recent buffs it has been receiving. I would just say like the Kipchuck is so strong because it has 3 pierce armor, I believe 170 HP after bloodlines, pretty reasonable attack and stats, and it's very cheap gold-wise and just resource-wise in general. So I believe it's like 40 food, 50 gold if they haven't changed it. So it just seems like such a strong unit overall. And the only weakness really for it is the fact that it has a little bit less attack than Cav usually has, and it has to be made for a castle. But otherwise, it's really good response to a lot of archer civs. Keshik is great, and then like Keshik plus Skirmisher can be a very good composition for the Tatars if they can't get away with their main composition, which is heavy Cav Archer plus Hussar. So gives them that nice little alternative. I think Keshik finds itself in a B tier to me. Next up, we've got the Kipchuck, and Kipchuck is going to find itself nicely in the A tier. I think I used to have this at an S tier, but it did receive a nerf recently, which made it fire slower, so it has a little bit of a delay there. I used to not have a delay. I don't know. Personally, I think the only weakness for the Kipchuck is that they miss Bracer for humans. Otherwise, it's an amazing unit, honestly. It doesn't die to rams, it has really good damage output, good in Castle Age, good later. It's just an amazing unit. With Bracer, it becomes S tier. Without Bracer, A tier is fine. Next up, we got the Conic, and the Conic is going to be, it's going to be B tier. I think I might surprise some people with this because Conic sounds like an amazing unit on paper, but I feel like it takes too long to get into. It takes so many upgrades for it, and in the end, it just becomes a unit that's really good against other melee units. But it's not better at raiding than Hussar is, for example. Not really, just has higher damage. It's not better at raiding than Cavalier is, for example. It's not like particularly strong against anything except melee units and other cavalry units. And the idea that conics don't die to halberdier is true, but it's just a late game concept, because even in early game, if the guy has halberdier opening and you have conics, your infantry, you're going to upgrade your cavalry units, but then your infantries will be weak, so halberdiers can still beat them. And if you go conic and you want to counter halberdier with conics, and your idea is I'm going to upgrade the infantry part first so that when they die I have a strong infantry, well then why not just go 200 swordsmen to begin with Bulgarians? So conic just feels a bit weird to me. It's B tier. It's a really strong unit, but it takes a lot of upgrades to get to. Lytis is going to follow short in B tier, like right away. Great unit at what it does, weak to archers. Though, is it better than a paladin? In some cases, yes. Some cases, no. Next up, we've got the longboat, and that's going to find itself in the S tier, believe it or not. Yeah, S tier for longboat, and this is because of just the role it plays for Vikings. Think about it. If other civs have longboats with like fast fire ships or with fire ships in general, that would be very strong. Whereas Vikings have longboats to compensate the fact that they don't have fire ships. So it literally fixes a problem that the civ has. Or because this unit is so strong, they have to give a really big disadvantage to the Vikings. And yet Vikings are still seeing so much play in water maps. It completely destroys fire ships. You don't need any upgrade to start making it in Castle Age. It makes the Viking FC very dangerous on water maps. It's just an overall great unit. It's not amazing in late game. Galleon usually becomes more cost effective, but as far as pop efficiency, longboat is right up there, and the mobility you get is very, very strong with it as well. So in my opinion, it just sees too much play to not put it at S tier, and the unit concept itself is very good. Next up, we've got the what is it called? The longbowmen. I'm just seeing where they get placed. They get placed at the A tier. Let me explain this for a second. So longbowmen is compared with the British or the Britons arbalest. Now their stats are very similar. There's just one thing about the elite longbowman that makes it way better, and that's that it has an extra range. That extra range lets it snipe bombard cannons a lot easier. It also lets it do damage from further, and also the longbowman has an extra 1 attack. So longbowman for me is just the same as an arbalest. The only weakness being that you have to make it from castles, but that's a very small weakness in late game for an archer unit that never dies. You know, for a cav unit, it's a pretty big weakness because you have to make them, you have to send them in. But for archer units, you have a mass and you're trying to keep it alive. That's the whole idea. If your archer units are getting cleared up, you're doing something wrong, and then obviously you're gonna have some problems. But yeah, the whole idea is to make them and keep them alive, and if they die, you just replenish them slowly with your castles, and you should be fine. So it fits in perfectly with the Britons. With the Britons kit, the reason it's not S tier is that arbalests solve almost the same problems that longbowmen solve. The longbowman just does it a little bit better, so it's not that important for the civ, basically. Next up, we've got the Magyar Hussar, and that's going to be a tier unit as well. So Magyar Hussar, the role that it serves for Magyars is perfect. I mean, a strong late game option, attack bonus for siege to snipe trebs and let them kind of survive till they get that really strong late game. And the fact that you make it from castles is like the only weakness for this unit. Otherwise, it's very cheap, very strong, and just like the overall best trash unit in the game. So easy A tier there for me. Next up is Mamluke, and I thought about giving it A tier, but I'm gonna give it B tier. And the reason is, I hope this doesn't mess up how it looks. No, it's fine. Yeah, the reason I'm gonna have to give Mamluke B tier, and I should put it probably here, is because it has really good early cast. It has really good late imp potential, but early cast potential it lacks because it has very little range. So it dies to a lot of things, and that early imp, like a lot of things can counter Mamluke and early imp. Like Halbs, for example, just running at Mamlukes can be pretty deadly, believe it or not. Because if the Halbs catch up, they do a lot of damage. And also, like Arbalest will destroy Mamluke. Mamluke is really only good against cavalry, so has a niche use and is very powerful late game. Even against infantry if you can get to all the upgrades. And it's good against siege as well because you have a lot of HP and you have a lot of mobility. And you don't die to rams because you do melee damage. So it has a lot of good positives there, but it's also very expensive and not very viable in the early cast stage. So B tier seems like a very reasonable place. Manga Die, S tier, no discussion to be had here. It's insane in early cast stage. It auto wins you certain matchups. It has an amazing late game. It doesn't die to siege. You can pick fights because you have a mobility advantage. It has such high DPS. Oh god, Manga Die is Manga Die. It's best units. Easily one of the best unique units. Might even be the best overall unique unit though, in my opinion. Because there's no other unique unit that like auto wins you matchups. Like that's such a crazy thought that like the Manga Die, you auto win Slav matchup, you auto win Teuton matchup. Like if anyone loses Mongols versus Slavs in a tournament game versus Mr. Yo, I don't even know what to say to that person, honestly. Next up here we got the missionary, and missionary is just it's a weird unit because it could be strong in certain cases because people underestimate it, but if you prepare properly to stop the missionary, it's kind of easy to stop. So I'm gonna put it at C tier. It's nice to have, but I don't think it's like game breaking or anything like that. It's like kind of troll in some cases, but it could be really weirdly powerful in some cases. I think it only works if people underestimate it. That's what I would say, the missionary rush. Next up is going to be the organ gun. Just an easy B tier here for me. It can be really strong in certain cases, really weak in other cases. It kind of dies versus archers, but it could be okay versus archers if they're bunched up. Versus Cav, same thing. It could be kind of good, but also kind of bad if they get up close. It really just depends on their positioning with them more than anything and how you use them. But I think overall it's strong enough to be a B tier, and it doesn't have that many weaknesses to really drag it down. Next up is the Plumed Archer, and that's going to see another S tier. Very viable off the start. I have the meme that Plumed Archers are trash, but honestly I've come around and I've seen them so often that like the nerf they got a year ago or something, like a year and a half ago with DE, or even a bit before that, I don't know, that made them more expensive. That was deserved. The unit was very strong, and it still is very strong. And it's just great for the mines to give them that extra mobility with their units. So yeah, not a lot of weaknesses here for Plumed Archers. Also for mines, they mine more stone because their resources last longer, so you have more castles to produce them from. Very good raiding units, very good archer unit in general. Doesn't really die to honor just because it has higher HP. Doesn't die to cav because it has mobility. And it's just a overall great unit. Doesn't die to infantry because it gets attack bonus. So yeah, only dies to Husker pretty much. Next up, we've got the Rattan Archer, and that's going to be A tier. The reason why Rattan Archer is not S tier is that it's slightly less mobile than Plumed Archer, slightly less smooth because it has more attack delay, but it does have more damage, and it also has less HP. And I compare it a lot with the Plumed Archer because they kind of fit similar roles as like a mobile archer civ, or archer unit rather. But the Rattan Archer is very good in late game. It has a lot of damage output. It's just not that good in the early game because it doesn't have a lot of HP. It has like 40 HP, I believe, in Castle Age. So it kind of like dies to Mangonels and Scorpions, unlike the Plumed Archer who can run away very easily and tank them in a lot of cases as well. So Rattan Archer has good damage, but yeah, it's a bit squishier. And it's not as smooth to micro. And it's good in late game as well, though. So it's a really strong unit, just not at the same level as the Plumes, in my opinion. Although Rattan Archer directly attacking Plume, Rattan Archer will win. So I want to stress that I'm not comparing the two in head-to-head combat, but rather in the role that they serve for their civ or for the strategy. Next up, the Samurai. Standard infantry unit, C tier. It has the weaknesses that infantry units have. It's very strong against what it is good at, though. And it's actually just very strong because Japanese infantry is strong in general. And it could be a good transition to get into sometimes after, in a skirm war, you switch to Samurai. But honestly, it just dies to Arbalest like any other infantry unit. So can't really be higher than than C tier for me. Next up, Jaguar Warrior, exact same reasoning, has the spot for the Civ, but has its weaknesses as an infantry unit. The Slinger is something I'll talk about. I'm going to put it in C tier as well. And the reason I'm putting Slinger in C tier is that think about every single infantry unit. It dies to Arbalest. Slinger is only good against Husker and Elite Eagle. Pretty much. Am I missing anything here? It's only good against those units. Otherwise, Arbalest do just as fine as the Slinger. So, like, it just feels like a bit too niche for me, to be honest. So that's why I put it at C tier. Tarkins are going to go to A tier. They're actually a very strong unit with the 4+4 Pierce Armor in late game, completely dominating archer units, and it's very fast to get into them because all you need is the elite upgrade and then Marauders, the unique tech, to be able to make them from stables, and that gives you a huge power spike with Huns. It's not better than a Paladin in head-to-head combat, but it serves a use that Paladin doesn't, which is to absolutely dominate archer civs. Paladin's good against archers, but Tarkins is even better. And its bonus damage against buildings comes up pretty clutch when you want to kill castles or town centers in the other guy's eco. So I think Tarkins are quite solid. Teutonic Knights, do I have to talk about them? It's the D tier. It's a fan favorite, I know. 12-year-olds that used to play the game that are now like, what is it, 32 or something. If you guys used to play the game back in the day, I totally understand. This was a fan favorite unit. I liked it as well. But it just sucks in most cases. So it does have some small uses, like under castle, some Teutonic Knights or Teutonic Knight Onager, like strong compositions late game, but you just rarely see them. So for me, it's a D tier. Next up is the Throwing Axemen. I thought of B tier. It's between C and B. I'm gonna put it in B tier, to be honest. Yeah, it's probably same situation as the Mamluke. Not that viable in early castle. It has some small uses, but it's really just a decent unit in Imperial Age, and it complements Franks really well because you have cheaper castles. You want to do Cav, they do Halbs, and then bam, you have Throwing Axemen, double gold composition. Very strong win for you. So Throwing Axemen kind of fits a good role, but it has some weaknesses, like it's very low range. It's not the strongest damage output in general, so yeah. Turtle ships, I mean, it's between D and C tier. And I have to talk about this because it sounds like it's a really strong unit on paper, but it actually is very expensive. And oftentimes it just doesn't do enough. I used to think it's strong, but I think that's because I didn't know how to play against it when Viper would pull it out versus me, for example. But honestly, I don't think it's that strong. Like, it's only good on small waters, like if you FC or something like that. But even then, like, controlling water usually comes in Feudal Age or in Castle Age with the mobile units because you want to snipe fish, keep your fishing ships alive, control the water. Turtle ships doesn't really do that much in that regard. It's terrible on big waters because it's so slow. It's very expensive. And even on small waters, you could just surround it with fire ships and you'll do just fine. So small niche uses, not amazing. Next up is the War Elephants, kind of following up the same thing with the turtle ship. Too slow, too expensive to be made any use. And it just dies to Halberdier and Monks too hard. So even in the late game, the only thing that War Elephants has is that's very pop efficient. But otherwise, it's just not the best unit, unfortunately. It just how the game is played. Next up is War Wagons. Now, War Wagons, I was actually debating S tier, but I'm going to set off for an A tier. They seem like the perfect A tier unit. They kind of remind me a little bit of the Janissary, where they're really strong out of the gate, like in early castle, especially because the Koreans are getting the free armor upgrades nowadays. But I think the War Wagon kind of falls off a little bit in early Imp. Like, something about it, it kind of dies to Cavalier, it dies to Halbram, it gets dealt with from skirmishers. It just feels like really weird early Imp. It's great late Imp, but you have a bunch of them and you have all the upgrades. It's good early Castle when you have a few of them versus like some crossbow skirmishers, especially if you mix in Siege. But that transition feels a bit weird, so that's why I didn't put them in S tier. And last but not least, we got the Woad Raider that's going to find itself in the B tier. It's an infantry unit, but it has extra mobility, and that's why it's better than the Samurai in a lot of cases. And it's also just very powerful in general. And it kind of fixes what the Celts lack, which is kind of a bit of mobility. So the role it plays for the Civ is very good, and that mobility puts it at B tier from C tier, which is where most of my infantry unique units are. We are done. It's been a long video, but I'm going to just end it by saying thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like and subscribe. I rarely ask for this, but it's why not. It helps the video. And let me know in the comments below what tier list you want to see next. I do take some inspiration from comments more often than not, and I'm doing these every 2 weeks, so you might as well put your opinion in there and see what happens. Thank you all for watching, and if you made it to this point in the video, you're a legend. Keep it up. I'll see you guys next time. Peace.